So hi everybody. So I'm Jamie McEwan. I'm the Conservation and Farm Manager at Kingsdale Head. My background is in nature conservation, and previously I managed the conservation team at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. I've been involved in lowland peatland restoration, river restoration, conservation grazing, NFM, people engagement, and I've had quite a broad experience of nature conservation in Yorkshire. Mainly though, I worked in the flat lowlands of the Humber Head levels, so quite a different landscape that I found myself in. I am not from Yorkshire, you might be able to tell. I'm from Scotland and perhaps living on the edge of Ironside a wee bit closer to home than the lowlands of South Yorkshire. So I am the conservation and farm manager. As much as I love our cattle, I'm really more of a conservationist and an ecologist than I am a farmer. What I really love about Kingsdale Head and about my job is the wildlife and being there to watch things change and develop. It is a diverse job that I have. I do manage our livestock, I manage our boundaries and dry stone walls, and there's a lot of them. But I also manage projects, monitor change, apply for funding, and another important part of my job is people. I work with partners, visitors, contractors, as well as communicating what it is that's happening at Kingsdale Head. So thank you to the Yorkshire Rewilding Network for having me here today, and for everyone here to listen. I had no idea so many people were going to sign in, so slightly scary, but thank you. Just to say, I am, as John mentioned, I'm very happy to have some questions, and I'll likely miss some things, so I'll look forward to hearing those later. So I am part of a team here at Kingsdale Head. I live here with my wife. Move on slides. So that's my wife and my dog Marge. I also work really closely with the site owners, Tim and Catherine. So obviously, Tim and Catherine own the site and are a big part of why we're here at Kingsdale Head. They have a background in finance, but have a number of years between them supporting nature and environmental charities. Catherine in particularly is heavily involved with Synchronicity Earth, the nature conservation charity, and as well as being the trustee of the Environmental Funders Network. I think it was this enthusiasm and commitment that led them to purchase Kingsdale Head, not a productive farm for livestock by any means, but with a great potential for biodiversity and carbon. So whilst that's the team, there is a huge amount of external knowledge and expertise that have contributed to the understanding of Kingsdale Head and the design and implementation of habitat restoration. In particular, the Yorkshire Peat Partnership have been heavily involved in doing a very in-depth condition assessment of our peatlands on Kingsdale Head. They've drawn up a thorough restoration plan, which is now in progress. We also work closely with the Woodland Trust, who have helped us understand some of the ecology outside of our peatlands, and with the design of the reintroduction of some scrub and trees to the site. And we've also worked closely with the Yorkshire Dales National Park, who have helped us navigate some of the funding available to projects like ours. We are also lucky to be in, and I'll talk about this a wee bit later on, but we're lucky to be in a really interesting landscape, not just because it is the Yorkshire Dales, but for rewilding and nature conservation. We've got the Wilder Inglewood project and the Yorkshire Dale and the Inglebrown NR, and some fantastic teams at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and Natural England there, who have been a great support to us as well. So just to give you a quick overview, this is Kingsdale Head, in the corner there, a little butterfly shape in red, right on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, and this is the Yorkshire Rewilding Network. We are right on the corner of Yorkshire and the border between Cumbria and Lancaster, so you can throw a stone in both directions. We are fairly typical, or were fairly typical before we started, of an upland farm in the Yorkshire Dales. I think there's been a farming of sorts, or a moorland community in Kingsdale for a very long time. But it wasn't till 1819 when the enclosure of Kingsdale, with a tremendous amount of dry stone walls, that Kingsdale Head Farm appeared. It's been a sheep farm with varying densities of sheep grazing, and it's largely lost a lot of its kind of moorland heath and tree cover, which we know that it once had. Of course, that means it's a fantastic opportunity for habitat restoration. So without necessarily having specific habitat targets, we wouldn't do this if we didn't know what was possible for a site like this, and what a diverse and interesting place it could be. So even before we started Kingsdale Head, and before we started the project before I started and before Kingsdale changed hands, it is a beautiful place, whatever way you think about it. It's got a huge range of altitude, geography, steep slopes, limestone outcrops, rivers, waterfalls, mature woodland. The point is, whilst it maybe ecologically wasn't everything it could be, it has a diverse range of features that create a massive potential for a diverse range of upland habitats and wildlife. A pretty picture. So this is our habitat map of Kingsdale Head, put together with the support of South Lakes Ecology, and it gives you a very broad understanding of the habitats at Kingsdale Head. So you can see in purple there a huge amount of blanket bog. Almost 2/3 of the site is on blanket bog or deep peat. We've also got some really steep slopes and high exposed slopes on the edge of Whernside and over on Gregath, which you can see in green. And then some steeper acid grassland slopes running down the gills, as well as our wet and dry heaths and orange and brown there. So quite a nice overview, hopefully. You can see it's a nice big block of intact sort of land. There's an awful lot of dry stone walls interspersed within that, but it's a largely enclosed block of the site. It's got almost 400 hectares of peatland, like I've mentioned, but with the potential to be a carbon storing, diverse and interesting wetland, which isn't presently. You can see in orange and red there the tremendous amount of drainage of the peatlands, and we'll talk a wee bit about that a wee bit later on. We've got steep-sided gills that are slowly recovering to heathland, and already they're noticeably busier with things like green hair streak butterfly, bilberry bumblebee. We have the potential in the future for red squirrel to come back, or even black grouse, making use of returning heathland and scrub. We've got a free-roaming herd of Rigget Galloway cattle. They're beautiful animals in themselves, but they're also have a fantastic benefit at the right density. I'll talk a bit more about that as well. There's a whole range of characteristic upland birds that we hope to see doing well on the site, some of which we have already: curlew, golden plover, ring-ouzel, short-eared owl, hen harrier, all fantastic, beautiful upland birds that we hope to see do well as well. There is a fantastic archaeological survey that was done in 2007. It's available online. I think it's called the Kingsdale Report by the Ingleborough Archaeological Society, so I got that wrong. The survey looked at things like charcoal analysis from a fire pit that was discovered on site, pollen analysis of the peatland, all pointing towards a more scrubby, open but wooded Kingsdale Head with hawthorn, hazel, alder, birch and pine all found. So really interesting, and not just that, further down the valley they found petrified wood in some of the fens with beaver teeth marks in. There was talk of reindeer in one of the caves, although I think that was some doubt was cast on that. So there's loads of information out there, and it points towards a Kingsdale with a tremendous amount of potential for wildlife, and to be a fantastic example of an upland biodiverse site. So why is it not reaching that potential? There's a number of reasons really that Kingsdale hasn't lived up to that potential in the recent past. I just look at a few of those reasons today and how we've gone about restoring them to a more diverse and interesting Kingsdale Head. So I'll maybe just have a look at some of these pictures as well. So this is just an example of some of the kind of interests. So we've got blanket bog there with kind of carnivorous plants like sundew. You can see some cranberry leaves, some sphagnum papillosum, like a nice big chunky sphagnum in there. You can see cowberry and heathland recovering. Yorkshire Dales. So going into a bit more detail on this big block of habitat on Kingsdale Head, these big purple sections of blanket bog, almost 2/3 of Kingsdale Head and around 60 kilometres of artificial drainage put in to try and improve these habitats to be more productive for grazing. So blanket bogs are actively growing healthy bogs anyway. They're wetlands. They're essentially consisting of two layers, really. A thin surface layer of peat-forming vegetation, maybe 10 to 40 centimetres, and then a relatively inert waterlogged peat store, huge carbon store underneath, which can be several metres deep. I think about 2 metres is as deep as it gets on Kingsdale Head. And you can see the difference here. So on the left, we've got a hag where you can see a different sort of surface vegetation, mostly grass and heath. And you can see the fragility and how damaged the peat store underneath is, cracked and eroding. And on the right, you can see bottom layer of sphagnum and then just a light canopy of heather. So it's a different sort of vegetation between a healthy and a damaged bog. In this way, you could maybe try and think of it as a bit like a tree. So you've got this living canopy of photosynthesizing vegetation, storing carbon, and a bottom layer, a trunk, if you like. So there are parts of Kingsdale which are quite severely damaged and completely lost this peat-forming vegetation as a result of drainage and grazing. Without this living top layer or canopy, the bottom layer can't really accumulate peat or control the loss of water, so it starts to oxidize and it starts to erode. So sticking with our woodland analogy, if a tree loses that canopy of leaves, that carbon store of wood and trunk survives, it stays there, but it's no longer growing. And often, like at Kingsdale Head, these peatlands are still vegetated, but more often by heathland or grassland communities, often making the problem worse by aerating the soil or removing moisture. It's a golden ringed dragonfly, a bit zoomed in. So peatland restoration on Kingsdale Head is focused on restoring that natural hydrology. And like I say, it depends on these wetland plants able to photosynthesize and control the hydrology of the peatland. So it's really been focused on restoring a natural hydrology with 4,000 leaky dams or more and sediment traps which have been installed to try and reinstate this natural hydrology in an attempt to re-establish blanket bog vegetation to a point where we have a healthy bog system, able to maintain its own water table, prevent the loss of further carbon from the peat, and in time begin to accumulate carbon in the form of peat again. You can see on the left there's a map where dark red showing our deepest peat and white are our least peaty areas. So you can see we've got a tremendous amount of peat. Actually lets us calculate a volume. So it's 3.2 million meters cubed of peat soils on Kingsdale Head, and obviously you can imagine the massive carbon store that is, and it's in poor condition at the moment. It's oxidizing, the water table's low, and that means a huge amount of emissions and erosion and loss of peat. So even without further sequestration of carbon, protecting that existing storage is tremendously important. Obviously, when we get to the point where we've got healthy habitats again, we may even start to sequester carbon again slowly. So obviously an important thing to do, obviously carbon is an important element of that, but peatlands are fantastic and interesting habitats in their own right. In rewilding, we often talk about the importance of structure and the kind of mosaics and zonation that you might get in good quality habitats like scrubland at Net, for example. On a much smaller vertical scale, of course, on a blanket bog, but they're still capable of that same small scale patterning and complexity that can support a wide variety of multicolored sphagnum species, support a wide variety of invertebrates and bird life. So that complexity and diversity is there. It's just it's squashed down to about a 40 centimetre vertical range, and it takes a wee bit more appreciation, I think, sometimes to see that in a healthy blanket bog. Hopefully we'll get there. So these are just a few pictures of the restoration as they go on. Like I say, 4,000 plus dams and sediment traps on Kingsdale Head. These are all designed differently depending on the type of drainage and the amount of damage, how far along those eroding gullies and grips are. They use stone dams in some of the worst of them, and these timber dams or peat dams even where things can be restored a bit more easily. Unfortunately, the majority of our drainage is quite far along, and the majority of those 4,000 dams are these stone sediment traps. For those of you that know Kingsdale Head or know landscapes like it, they're wet and steep and difficult to access, and moving 4,000 stone dams onto site is no mean feat, not to mention potentially damaging. The best way to do this seems to be using helicopter. So the helicopter collects stone from the bottom of the site and it's delivered onto site using this hopper that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there. It's a very efficient and low impact way of doing it. And I understand anybody who would be concerned about the potential carbon emissions of flying a helicopter around the stone in order to protect something that you're concerned about the carbon emissions from. As it happens, carbon emissions are paid off. The carbon cost of doing this work is paid off within the first few years of the work. And peatlands are tremendously stable once they're healthy. Some of them have been around for 10,000 years, and they continue to sequester carbon as they're around. So it's a worthwhile thing to do. That's what I'm trying to say. Obviously, has a bit of a close-up on my face. Sorry about that. Obviously, there are other factors that have influenced the biodiversity in Kingsdale Head, and one of those main ones is the influence of herbivores. Mainly in its history, that's been sheep. I'm almost smiling in this picture. I'm not convinced why. Obviously Kingsdale Head's got a long history as a farm, and grazing animals have been a dominant form of management of the land for a long time. As a result of previous agricultural subsidies, grazing numbers have been particularly high in the past, as many as 800 breeding sheep on our 600 hectares. That density of disturbance through trampling and grazing has a knock-on negative impact on the diversity of plant species and the diversity of structure of vegetation in Kingsdale. It happens over such a long time that many of us could go to a landscape like Kingsdale Head and think, what a wonderful wild place it is. And in fact, it's far from everything it could be. So if grazing has been a problem in the past, then why are we still using grazing animals as an important part of the management at Kingsdale Head? So this is a bit of a simplified graph, but the graph to the side is sort of demonstrating something called intermediate disturbance hypothesis, ecological thing. But at the extreme end, we have this catastrophic disturbance resulting from loss of species altogether, a quarry or a car park or something. Slightly less extreme, you might have low levels of diversity, but very high levels of disturbance in the form of high density sheep grazing or something like that. At the other end of the graph, we have something called competitive exclusion, and this is why grazing is important at Kingsdale Head. We could have removed all disturbance, all grazing at Kingsdale Head, but no grazing at all. What can happen is that dominant species can exclude less competitive species in what is now quite a stable ecosystem. The suggestion is that small amounts of disturbance that create opportunities for a wilder range of species has a beneficial overall effect on diversity of plant species. And as a result, the diversity of structure and the amount of wildlife and habitat that the habitat can accommodate. course, the real picture is a lot more complicated than this, and it acts across a range of timescales, physical scales, and habitats, some of which are more sensitive to this disturbance than others. Natural ecosystems would have a range of species and natural processes providing disturbance in small amounts, including aurochs, wild cattle, wild boar, tarpan or wild horses, bison, deer, all having slightly different impacts depending on their physiology, behaviour, or numbers. Without this diversity of natural herbivores and in an effort to replicate this natural level of grazing and disturbance, we have a small herd of cattle. We use Rigate Galloways as they are an archaic strain of Galloway, and they're bred to cope with rough grazing in the southern uplands of Scotland. Perfect candidates really for these to provide these natural processes at Kingsdale Head. Grazing is a difficult subject because it interacts with a lot of other restoration options at Kingsdale Head, but we've taken the approach of a very small number of grazing animals, and we're monitoring that very closely. And we can talk a wee bit more about how we do that in a minute. These are our Rigate Galloways. That's Bonnie and our calf from this year. And these are our GPS collars. These are our no fence collars that we use to monitor the cattle, and some more calves from this year. And a dung beetle. So nice. So one of the concerns about grazing is that these large herbivores capable of disturbance are using parts of the site that are more sensitive to disturbance, like our blanket bogs. So here we've got one of our steers in amongst some area from cotton grass. The reality is we're having to balance the positive impact of cattle versus any potential negative impact of disturbance on blanket bogs. And in reality, we believe that I think a cattle's natural behaviour takes care of an awful lot of this. Cattle want to graze things that meet their nutritional requirements, and in reality, I think for most of the year, a blanket bog doesn't. And that's a conversation to have though with the people that support land management in Kingsdale Head, and we come to a solution of monitoring this impact closely. We use these no fence collars that provide us with really detailed GPS data about where the cattle are and aren't, more importantly. You can see on screen the map with the result of a year's worth, almost a year's worth of cattle grazing on site. And you can see there's a lot of grazing concentrated around some of our most improved in-by fields, where the pasture is quite lush and the nutritional quality is quite good, presumably. And then some concentration of grazing up some of our rivers and gills with very little interaction with these blanket bogs, these big areas which haven't been interacted with at all by the cattle. You can see some blobs there on the right hand side where they've used the acid grassland slopes on the very top near Whernside. So all of this is really quite light, gentle grazing, and does confirm that the management plan that we put in place for these cattle is largely appropriate for the site. So concerning ourselves with what cattle aren't doing, they do have a positive influence on a lot of the habitats on the site. In particular, we've got two small meadows in-by fields of different qualities and conditions. One of them in particular is slightly less improved, a wee bit more potential for to be restored for a bigger botanical diversity. And the other a bit more agriculturally improved, had nutrient inputs and drainage, and its potential to be botanically rich is a wee bit less. That's not to say that there's not opportunities for fields like this for restoration and diversification of habitats and processes. This is an example of our most improved, agriculturally improved in-by field. And this was in November when I started. So there's a wee bit of artistic license here because the seasons are slightly different. But you can see it's largely perennial ryegrass, green lush grassland, not a tremendous amount of diversity there. You can just about see some potholes there in the ground where a stone drain is clapped. So it's artificially drained, dried, and improved chemically with fertilizers. This is it the following year with a relaxation of grazing. So this is just winter grazing on these fields. It's not tremendously diverse in terms of interesting species or a whole range of flora, but it has got structure. It's got willow herbs coming through, marsh marigolds, meadow sweets. There was a marsh valerian in there, and just the number of inverts and the number of and the amount of structure that's reintroduced to this field has benefits. I'll come back to these pigs. Things like tall vegetation being beneficial for birds like stonechat and redpoll, making use of, and goldfinches and things making use of thistle seeds. So there's a diversity that comes to these places with a reinstating of natural processes and natural hydrology, and it's been nice to watch. Coming back to our pigs, I've mentioned this positive influence of herbivores and that small level of disturbance. Pigs are the ultimate disturbance machines. They're fantastic at their jobs. We don't have pigs on Kingsdale anymore, but we ran a short experiment last year on this more improved in Byfield. So you can, I like this picture, but we used 2 Tamworth pigs over quite a big area for quite a short period, just to see what impact disturbing some of these dense, improved grasslands could have. And the results were quite positive. Interestingly, they were very good at picking out the least improved parts of the field, the steep slopes and the areas where there was more interesting things to eat, because there was like more soil biodiversity, more slug swarms, pignut, etc. And there it was doing its job quite happily. One of the things I wanted to point out was the importance of monitoring these fields. We've got, like I said, we've got 2 in Byfield, one which was very heavily improved, which I've just shown you, and we didn't have a lot to lose almost. We could break up the drains, introduce the pigs, and create a bit of disturbance and see what happens. On the other field, it was a bit more interesting. So although Kingsdale has been heavily grazed in the past, it's an old place. It's been permanent pasture for a very long time. And with that comes a few qualities and interesting things, not least of all these wax cap fungi. And it just highlights the importance of watching and monitoring. This isn't a particularly interesting field, but in the autumn, just as the flowers are going over, we get a fantastic display of wax cap fungi. Wax cap fungi are indicative of kind of undisturbed old acid grasslands, and that's what we have. And so the way we treated those 2 fields were quite different. I wouldn't put the pigs in this field because I didn't want to create that disturbance. I didn't want to potentially lose some of this diversity that we've got. And so we've treated them slightly differently, and it's something that we can hopefully maintain. So lastly, I just wanted to look at trees in the uplands. So with the exception of 3 mature woodlands at Kingsdale Head, the most obvious thing that's missing, for people that are interested in things like trees and ecology, is that there are, with the exception of 3 mature woodlands, Kingsdale is missing trees. It's quite a nice aerial photo to demonstrate. We have these mature woodlands in the bottom of some of our gills, often plantation woodlands, so we've got a lot of beech and spruce and things like that. They look to have been grazed in the past, so we don't have a lot of understory, a lot of natural regen underneath. And there's quite an abrupt end to them where they've been walled or fenced to separate them from grazing livestock. We also have just above these woodlands, which you can't quite see, but you might just see in the difference in vegetation, there's some exclosures where the previous farmer at Kingsdale Head did some woodland grant scheme planting. So we have some 7 or 8 year exclosures there, and the tree planting hasn't been tremendously successful in these areas, but the vegetation change has. There's some great heathland recovery, tremendous amounts of green hair streak butterfly, bilberry bumblebees, invertebrates, and the trees are coming. That might be partly down to maintenance, maybe partly down to management or the initial planting. Now here's some of our mature woodlands from the inside. So, of course, Kingsdale Head does have these large areas of blanket bog, which we expect to remain open and wet. But we do have steep acid grassland slopes, meadows, stream edges, where we'd expect to see the whole range of upland vegetation. Without the biodiversity and structural complexity that comes with trees and scrub and more diverse herb layer, Kingsdale Head won't support the range of species that it could do. With a lack of seed source, we are planting trees to reintroduce scrub and a range of trees to the landscape. As always, it's the right tree in the right place. But we hope this active approach to establishment of trees and scrub can lead to an actual regeneration in the long term. The three main things I've mentioned that are important to us in restoring a more diverse Kingsdale: peatland restoration, grazing animals, tree planting, all important factors, but they all interact with one another and not always in the way that we might consider positive. We have to understand how the interruption of gentle disturbance through our cattle will influence habitats more sensitive to disturbance, like blanket bogs, or the success of our tree planting. We have to make sure the right tree is planted in the right place and that reintroduction of scrub doesn't negatively influence the rewetting of peat or the restoration or the nesting of breeding birds like curlew. The answer is to monitor it carefully, and we do with support from the GPS No Fence collars, which I've mentioned, the Woodland Trust supporting time for an ecologist to help us understand the change in pollinators and breeding birds, and riparian invertebrates. And we're also working with the Yorkshire Peat Partnership to monitor intensively the condition of our blanket bogs. All of this helps us understand the way that Kingsdale is responding to our type of management, and we can change it if need be. Finally, people are an important part of the success at Kingsdale Head. Sorry, I've got the pictures there. And we need to be able to demonstrate that this type of land management is a viable alternative in the uplands. And we need to be able to communicate this, as well as making Kingsdale Head available to people, for people to enjoy. We have a holiday cottage, which is available to rent on Airbnb and booking.com, which was set up last year and has been quite successful. And we're this year developing an offer of some guided walks through the summer, that people are able to book on, so keep an eye out for that. Yeah, lastly, I just wanted to say that whilst it's great to have big sites like Kingsdale Head, nature recovery has to happen across the whole landscape, and there's some great things happening around us, such as the Wildlife project and the Woodland Trust's project at Snaysholm. Most recently, we've been successful in a pilot landscape recovery scheme called the Yorkshire Dales project, where we'll be working with the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and the Wildlife project to look at how we can connect up sites across the landscape for bigger and better outcomes. So it's really quite exciting stuff. And I think there's a great place for the Yorkshire Rewilding network there to help inspire people and bring people together that are doing this type of work. So, so it's fantastic to be able to speak to you all today. So a few more pictures of some sphagnum. Last and not least, we've also developed some of our buildings to accommodate people and invite people to the farm. I took this last minute before today, so it's not the best picture that I've produced on this PowerPoint, but we've now got capacity to host groups and education groups. We've had university groups and school groups come to us, but we're also available for meetings at request. So feel free to get into touch if that's something you're interested in. So I'll just hand it back over to Jeff, and thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thanks, Jamie. That's astonishing. Oh, I've got a bit of an echo there.
Sorry, I'll just
try that. Thank you. Astonishing the range of disciplines and skills you've got to apply. So you kind of think of an upland area and the mix of farming, ecology, but all the different branches of ecology, archaeology, all the different things you've had to take into account there is brilliant. So thanks for sharing that for us. Got quite a few questions already. If people would like to put them in the Q&A, and I'll just sort of, as I say, try and group them. You mentioned towards the end there, Jamie, about surrounding schemes. Is there scope or intent of applying for landscape scale funding sort of across that whole upland area? What's likely to go there?
Yeah, so we applied with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust to be part of the landscape recovery scheme, which is a sort of top tier of the ELMS scheme. That included ourselves, Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, complementary sites at the NNR, which obviously aren't benefiting from funding, but also some of our neighbours as well, with almost the potential to see a sort of physical connection between us and the NNR. The main focus of that application was black grouse and curlew, and that's something we've got curlew at Kingsdale Head. We haven't got black grouse yet, but our populations, very small populations in the landscape, so it's a real target. But they're talking about 30-year schemes here, so yeah. So it's a good aim, I think.
That'd be lovely. I get excited when people start talking about golden eagles back in England as well as a prospect. So the way you were talking about the landscape up there, that would be a lovely one to see. Somebody's just asked, will a recording of the talk be available? It will. We'll put it on our website in the next few days. So keep a look out there. Do you have yet, Jamie, or will you have volunteering opportunities for people on the estate?
Yeah, there's always plenty of work to do. We are planting some trees at the moment, so I'm usually happy to have help with that. And there's some more specific dates that can be made available for anyone that's interested. As well as any talented tri-stone mowers that are interested in coming up, they'd always be welcome.
Okay, thank you. Certainly something we'd be happy to publicise through YRN as well. Looking at the peatland and the year that we've had, how did it respond to the high summer temperatures, or is it sort of so dry and degraded that it was all couldn't get much worse?
No, it wasn't as bad up at Kingsdale as elsewhere to start with, so we still got some rain, but yeah, it's the beginning of our monitoring period for the peatland restoration. So we were monitoring the water table and how it responded. Peatlands are tremendously stable, and the healthy ones are in their water table, so they don't tend to fluctuate much from ground level. And so yeah, we were seeing drawdown and lower water tables than we'd like for a healthy peatland. But this was our baseline year for monitoring, so it doesn't give us
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm kind of having to reflect the diversity of things you've got to cover here. I'm going to jump around a bit to the archaeology. Are there any sort of particular significant archaeological sites on the farm, and how are they protected, or do you do anything to kind of increase understanding of people and that heritage that surrounds it for visitors?
Yeah, so that Kingsdale report, I'd really recommend. It's available online, and it's got some fantastic information about the archaeology on Kingsdale Head, Kingsdale as a whole. But yeah, we've also got the formal record from the national park of any of the specific features. And there's some more interesting than others within that. But yeah, the Mesolithic settlement down by one of the woodlands is probably the most interesting, and that's where the fire pit remains were investigated as part of that report. So Mesolithic settlements burning hazel and hawthorn and alder and birch and all the things that we hope might start to colonise the bottom of that valley. So it's quite nice to have confirmation that they were here once before, and it's possible to have them back. So yeah, that's probably the most interesting one.
It gives you a perspective on the kind of timescales that the land works to, rather than our rush to accomplish things quickly, doesn't it? To kind of get that background to what the site was in hundreds and thousands of years ago.
Yeah, certainly things move slowly up here. Like I mentioned, that I worked in South Yorkshire before, and often we're tackling scrub and trees to try and maintain some open habitats. Up here, it's not quite the same. So it's a slower transition. Definitely.
Thank you. Two people have asked, what do your neighbours think about what you're doing? Which is a common question for people with rewilding projects, as to it often varies.
Yeah.
How is it up there?
Yeah, I don't know. We've met all of our neighbours, and we've had a broad range of responses to what we're doing. Some more positive than others, but it's a positive thing we're doing. I think in terms of risk to others and things, it's pretty low. We're not trying to change other people's minds. We're just here to do this and potentially demonstrate what's possible, but not necessarily to force anyone else to do anything else. So it's there as information for people. But it's,
Hi Jeff, it's Tim here.
Tim, do
just
chip in. Sorry, I should have invited you to.
No, sorry, no, I was just thinking on that. Sorry, I'm Tim, by the way, everyone. It's obviously not daylight where I am, but the background is. I say about the neighbours thing, and I saw somebody else has asked about a business plan. I say, yes, as Jamie says, we've had some generally curious neighbours, I'd say. You know, we are surrounded by multi-generational sheep farming in general, or cattle grazing. And I think a lot of them are curious. Yeah, we've been very gentle about the way we approach it. We're saying that we're not trying to tell anybody what to do, but we are trying to prove the case that you can farm for different outcomes. And yeah, in our case, I guess I say to some people, you know, we're farming for carbon and biodiversity, as well as alternative incomes, maybe a little bit from cattle, but I mean, largely it's a carbon and biodiversity story. And some are very curious and interested. So if we can prove the economic value of it, you know, we have got one particular neighbour who, you know, it could possibly follow, but he's got to know that the economics make sense, which is a big challenge because, you know, obviously this without subsidies, but I'd say without subsidies, all of the upland sheep farms around us are not economically viable either. So we're all, but lots of them aren't. So we're trying to prove try and prove the case that we can do this based on some subsidy, but also hopefully largely ultimately, and this is part of the ELMS landscape recovery scheme, is to have that then funded by, you know, either corporations who actually have to do who may have to offset, or biodiversity loss, etc. So selling those credits. So we've got, you know, a range of views. Some think we're doing a terrible thing because we haven't got sheep. But I think most of them are just kind of curious.
Well, I think seeing is believing. So yeah, it's understandable when people, as you say, are multi-generational, tending to work one way and a progression along that to have to experience a change. And there's a piece, the first question that came in, I've kind of not waded straight in with, but I think now makes sense, is from somebody local to you up there, saying, having worked with both Jamie and Amy and Tim and Catherine, so Jamie and Amy are the farm managers and Tim and Catherine the owners of the site, your passion for Kingsdale comes through. How can we translate that passion that we all have on these kind of calls to help farmers and other landowners understand that rewilding isn't a dirty word or something to be feared? I'd invite you two to comment on that, then I'd like a go.
Yeah, Jamie, if I'll just start, you can take over. I would say it is by demonstrating it and by talking to people. So the educational part, Jamie has done quite a lot of talking with groups across the site. I mean, a lot of them are conservationists anyway. So you could say you've got a bit of an echo chamber, but equally we've had various people up who have been learning about, you know, peatlands, learning about what we're doing, about the tree planting. Yeah, we've only just started it, but school groups as well are part of that. So I think it's a big part of education and trying to be very transparent about what you're doing. We are very open about the whole process, the finances of it, sort of the process by which we've gone through trying to apply for various grants or succeeding and not. In our case, we've had a very frustrating period actually, or time with some of that, but it's about trying to educate people and ourselves. I mean, for me, this has been a massively steep learning curve. So it's educating all of us really, and just trying to engage with people and explain why we're doing it and the reasons behind it. And to that end, we are going to start doing some more guided, more formally guided walks next year as well, so that we can get more people up. We've got a small holiday let. I mean, this is tiny, but people come up, and Jamie often takes them around the farm and explains to them what we're doing, the reasons why. It's amazing how people then engage with the process. Jamie, what do you feel?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, Tim. I maybe avoid using the word rewilding quite often, just because I don't like the idea of, I don't know, it has a polarizing effect sometimes, particularly with our neighbours potentially, or local farmers. But yeah, it's there's stages and ranges within that, and a small part of a busy, productive landscape can't support wolves and lynx, and yet it's not a concern at the moment, and that rewilding is at this scale and in this landscape is a positive thing. It's not a scary process, largely not too drastically different, really. So yeah.
I think, and sorry, Jeff, just about one thing. I mean, just in terms of some of our engagement, we were looking for some match funding for the peat restoration. We were short of some funding, which we had gained through Yorkshire Peat Partnership, part of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, obviously, but it needed some match funding. And in fact, I was able to find, rather surprisingly in some ways, a bunch of lawyers, a group called Brabners, who some of you may or may not have heard of. They're in Leeds, Manchester, Lancaster, I think. And they were looking to spend some philanthropic money really on doing something to do with peat. And we got them to come up to the site, one of their partners and a couple of other members of staff. And when they engaged, they saw the site, they understood what we wanted to do, and they did provide this stub of financing that was needed for the peat restoration. So I think it really shows. And then since then, they have been up and visited the site for a volunteer day. In fact, one of you was asking about volunteer days. Came up with a tree planting day with Jamie and somebody from the Woodland Trust. And so I think it just shows, when you start engaging, we stopped up in Manchester on the way up one time, and Jamie came down and we gave him a talk about what we were doing for the rest of their staff. So I think it's all about broadening out that message, and they're of course now starting to tell other people as well what we're doing and what they're doing.
Yeah, thank you both. We took a very deliberate decision 2.5 years ago when setting up YRN that we would use the R word, and it's staggering to me how in that 2 and a bit years, almost all the talk about rewilding now is the impact of large herbivores and the functioning of the ecosystem. You very rarely go near apex predators. And, May 2020, so just about 2.5 years ago, Royal Geographic Society had an event in Pateley Bridge, and straight away all the discussion was you can't have bears and wolves in Harrogate. It was that kind of basis. And there was mention in some of the chat earlier about Feral, George Monbiot's early book on rewilding and the impact of sheep. Things like that have certainly grabbed attention, but do tend to divide. And one of our real sort of tenets at YRN is to try and be inclusive. And as much as the education bit that has been mentioned, I think listening to people's valid concerns is important as well, which we try and do. And it's really heartening the range of people from all walks of life that are getting interested and energized by rewilding. And then people like yourselves, like a lot of the other estates through Yorkshire now, you see whether it's our map or the number of people that attended a dinner at Harewood, a different set of lawyers, Tim, kindly funded by Clarion solicitors as part of their sort of ESG effort to bring together some of the large landowners and the likes of YRN just to discuss future enterprise options for Yorkshire Estates. So I think it's discussing it, listening, being pragmatic about it rather than idealistic, and just seeing what the evolution of particularly the Yorkshire uplands could be going forwards, because there is, in my mind, an absolutely gorgeous future there, still identified with the Dales, but with that wildlife there, so that when you go there, you see that lovely shape of landscape, but with longer vegetation on it, and thriving with animals. So that's my hope for the future in the area. After that lecture, thank you for indulging me. I'll just nip back to the questions that are still coming in. Do you have any breeding raptors on the site yet or nearby, do you know?
Yes. So Kingsdale and the landscape generally, I think, is quite good for raptors. Breeding on the site, we've definitely had Yorkshire Dales. The first year we were here, we had a real flush of voles and things like that, which meant we had, I think, 6 barn owls on Christmas Day, on our first Christmas Day here. But we also had Yorkshire Dales that summer. Barn owls and kestrels. We do get hen harrier coming across the site. I don't believe they're breeding here, but they're using Kingsdale. And yeah, Yorkshire Dales. Tawny owls on site.
Right.
Yeah.
Few more to skip through. About another 6 questions have just come in, so I'll get to as many of these as I can in a couple of minutes. Do you do anything to try and encourage the cattle to graze in a way that they might do if there were large predators around? I know some people talk about mob grazing with no fence collars and trying to move them on using that, or do you just let them go where they prefer?
Yeah, sure. I should have said with the grazing analysis that we did, what I was really checking with that was that how we were managing the cattle was working, because we do manage the cattle. They're not an entirely free roaming herd, in part because we have roads and exclosures, but also because with the different altitudes and seasons that you get in a landscape like Kingsdale Head, there's good justification, I think, to move them up and down the hills through the season, as opposed to just giving them free rein to use the best of their habitat all the time. So yeah, we do move them between quite large exclosures. So they're still really quite free roaming in large exclosures, but we do move them around just to keep things fresh and to keep the grazing pressure light. So, and in some ways, I suppose we are mimicking that effect. But, and we will produce a beef product at some point.
Thank you.
So Jeff, just one more, just in terms of the other thing which we haven't talked about, and it's sometimes a bit unpopular, but we do have somebody who culls deer. We don't have a big deer problem, but we have mature trees and obviously the trees we've planted. So deer predation of the trees, of the young stock, is quite it is an issue. So we do have some, if you call that mimicking an apex predator, we do have a bit of that happens. It's a very small number, to be honest, that we have a problem with. But.
So do you need to guard the trees, or does that control mean that you can get away without?
Interestingly, the existing planting that was done prior to us getting there, which was all in these English woodland grant schemes, were all in tubes and with stakes. They've been mixed success, to be honest, either through maybe poor planting where the tubes haven't engaged with the land, and we've had a lot of voles that have then got into the tubes and they use them as a as a nice warm place. But also, before we got there, the deer were not being culled, and so they end up like these little canopy tubes where everything was being chopped off at the top. So all the planting we're doing, I say I've done a bit of it, but I have to say Jamie's done nearly most of it. So he's done about 40,000 trees so far. Is it all being done without tubes and stakes? So we're doing them bare root into the soil and leaving them to actually get their roots settled better. It's early days, obviously. It's only 2.5 years since we've been, about 2 years of planting, and they do appear to be taking really well. So they are unprotected. So we do need to keep the sheep off, and we need to make sure that we don't have a big deer problem. So far, so good. Obviously, there's a big reason for that. I mean, lots of reasons. One, we think it looks nicer without the tubes and stakes, and there's a big carbon impact of the tubes and stakes. But also, they do get better roots. Because the cost of doing it, it's not quite, but it's about 10% of the price. So you can put in 10 times as many. So even if we only had a 50% success rate, we still have a better outcome.
And I think it does result in a better low story of branching as well.
Yeah.
You get lollipops if you use long tubes, don't you?
We have lots of lollipops, yeah.
I'm going to draw us towards a conclusion. There are numerous other comments and questions about monitoring nitrates and phosphates, working with the community forests, methane emissions from cattle, rabbits, but just the last couple of bits. One suggestion is, have you considered having Duke of Edinburgh Gold residential sessions to introduce the next generation to what you're doing? Could be one for the future.
It's not something I've had experience of. But, if somebody was telling me more about it, I'm sure.
Okay. And what was the other one I was just looking for?
I just saw somebody say something about beavers. We'd
Yes.
love to have. I mean, to me, beavers are an end game. We'd love to have them. We don't have enough habitat for them yet.
We need some trees first.
So we need more trees. Yeah.
But a direction of travel, that's nice to hear.
Yeah.
So the last question I'll put to both of you, what's the biggest success or the thing you're most pleased with in the time you've been involved with Kingsdale so far?
Well, I could easily start that by saying employing Jamie, because he's been a fantastic asset to the place. So anyway, other than inflating his ego too much now, which is, I think, very hard. No, so I mean, for us, it's, I think actually the immediate impact, I'll just put that into context. When we bought it, the land had been in a higher level stewardship scheme for 9 years. And so there had been reduced sheep grazing on the land, but not aggressively controlled, I suppose. So for us to see after literally 1 year, but now 2 years, the impact of having no sheep has been really dramatic. The amount of cowberry, sort of cloudberry, everything has grown so much more. So I think actually just seeing that immediate impact has been fantastic.
And that's a common response to the other projects around the region as well, that you can go into these sometimes thinking this is a 10, 20, 50-year project. And it is, if not longer, but you do see a real response in the first couple of years. I'm now trying to fill desperately while Jamie shuts the dog up and comes back. Jamie, what's your biggest success?
I know a lot of it's being delivered through partners and things, but I think that's a success in its own. But the peatland restoration has been the single sort of biggest piece of work. It is a big site, and 4,000, 5,000 dams is a lot to put on site. There's a lot to consider amongst all of it, and we're a large part through the bulk of that now, which is it's exciting because it makes up such a big chunk of Kingsdale Head, that peatland, and to see it with I think a lot of habitats you step away from and they have a positive trajectory, or you're lighting that impact, whereas the peatland stepping away from them, they were still on that negative trajectory. Doing that peatland restoration and things start to get better. That's quite a satisfying thing to watch happen. So I'm pleased that that's underway.
Thank you. Well, thanks again, Jamie, and to you, Tim, for having delivered this evening's presentation, and for, in Tim's case, letting Jamie do that. I've tried a couple of times to get up to Kingsdale and been diverted by other things, so I haven't managed it yet, but I'm definitely not going to leave it long. Both to see it before it recovers too much, and then over time to see it steadily improve. So again, Jamie, the range of stuff you deal with so well up there is brilliant. Thank you. It's been lovely to see such a geographically diverse range of people here this evening. We've had the joy of having this publicised through Rewilding Britain's network, not just in Yorkshire. So I will just emphasise that those who maybe not heard it as much before, we do rely on donations and occasional grants to fund our activity. So there's a QR code there if you would care to go to our donations page, or you can use the text, as we said at the start. Seems to have vanished. I'll stop sharing in a second and effectively end the webinar, but just try if I can to leave that that screen up for a wee while.
Jeff, Jeff, can I just ask a quick question? Any of the questions that we haven't answered, I'm happy for people, if you want to, I presume people can see our email address. I mean, Jamie or tim@kingsdalehead.com, but.
Okay, yes, I'll feed them through.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, actually people will need probably to email in to our end, because I could feed them to you, but I clearly can't, for data protection, share their contact details with you. So people can either get in touch kindly with Tim or Jamie. The Kingsdale Head website, I think, also has their contact information on. So do it that way, but that's kind of you. Thanks, Tim. Finally, thanks to John for arranging and introducing this evening. And John will in fact be presenting or emceeing our next webinar, which is the 17th of January, I think, is a midwinter rewilding quiz. And if you know John, that is going to be very entertaining, no matter what format we adopt for it. So have a great Christmas, everybody. And all I can wish you is a very wild new year. Take care, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.